Does Mr. Bishop seek, for what purpose does Mr. Bishop seek recognition?
I'll speak on the amendment.
Gentleman is recognized.
You know, it's interesting. I learned a good bit in the scramble to get ready for this hearing, last minute call in the middle of recess, as we've discussed. But Mr. Tiffany had an amendment earlier today. I don't know if most Americans realize this, but in the existing law, it is unlawful for any person who has been adjudicated as a mental defective or who has been committed to a mental institution to possess a weapon, to receive a weapon in interstate commerce, the way it's specifically phrased. And as has been said, and I think is not generally understood, these Baker laws that exist, and I think that's the general term for them, Mr. Massey, they exist in state after state. It's not surprisingly, if you go look at the history of gun control, this has been a subject that's been debated for many, many years, and those things that are evidently appropriate have long since been dealt with. The difference between those laws that have been considered and undertaken over the course of years in the United States before and red flag laws is the words "who has been adjudicated." That is the nature of the process. These are fundamental constitutional rights that we're talking about. And we, of course, seem to have some difference of opinion about that. Some don't know that Heller recognized a fundamental constitutional right applicable to individuals under the Second Amendment. But you really cannot justify stripping someone of a fundamental constitutional right without giving them due process. Due process has a meaning of its own. The amount of process that is due has always been commensurate with the nature of the right. If we're talking about stripping someone of a fundamental right, you cannot make a very good case for skipping some limited amount of process. The adjudication of a judge on partial, an affidavit or two, particularly by a witness who may be loaded with bias for the reasons Mr. Gates articulated.
Without a chance to challenge it.
Gone. And then the way these things the one that was stuck in the NDAA this year, and I believe the one we have that I'm hearing talked about is similar. It's the kind of thing that can renew itself. It can go up to like 180 days and can renew indefinitely. It's a permanent deprivation, masquerading as a temporary one, which should not be done in any event. So it is. I will say I'm waiting to see what the arguments are of those who advocate for this, but I think it is almost impossible to justify. And our law to this date recognizes it. That's why that appears in our existing statute as it does. That people are entitled to due process. I yield to the gentleman from Florida.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. It's also interesting to note that in many cases, the red flag law process itself would not be the most effective means of dealing with someone who is truly intent on committing one of these terrible atrocities that we all want to stop. I mean, keep in mind, in the Parkland case, you had a neighbor witness the shooter practicing in their backyard. And the neighbor was a responsible American who called the FBI and told them. So you had probable cause in that case to actually engage in legitimate law enforcement activity to stop violence, and it didn't happen. And so instead of fixing that, which totally ought to be the priority of the committee, we're instead trying to go into this kind of tit for tat, where someone with a motive against you, someone that maybe fired you from a job, maybe someone you had an unsuccessful relationship with in business or in your personal life, that would be the basis for some sort of red flag action. And so I think that you're looking at something here that has high likelihood of depriving rights, very, very low likelihood of actually being the effective mechanism to stop any type of violence.
And another thought before my time expires. One thing that really, the longer I'm here, worries me more and more is the capricious use of power by government officials. And if you don't, if you don't have a sense of that, you haven't been paying attention to the American people. There's a lot more that could be said about that. Perhaps somebody else will speak to it. I will if they don't. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purposes, gentlelady from Georgia seek recognition?
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to strike the last word to oppose this amendment.
Gentlelady is recognized.
First, I'd like to say we know that 19 states, including the state of Florida, has a form of red flag laws statewide. President Biden, both President Trump, both support these laws. Following the deadly shootings in El Paso, Texas, and Dayton, Ohio, President Trump said, and I quote, "We must make sure that those judged to pose a grave risk to public safety do not have access to firearms, and that if they do, those firearms can be taken through rapid due process." And that is why I have called for red flag laws, also known as extreme risk protection orders, end quote. Might I remind you, my colleagues, my Republican colleagues, that this legislation that I have put forth, I have lifted the language directly from the language of Senator Lindsey Graham and Senators Richard Blumenthal in the Senate. There is nothing different about this legislation. They first introduced this bipartisan legislation in 2018. This has already been marked up. It has already been agreed upon by our colleagues here in this committee, and it will be voted on in the House, and it will pass. But there again, let me remind you that Republicans as well as Democrats have deemed that this federal extreme risk protection order and also the state orders are vitally necessary to preventing unnecessary carnage. So there is due process that is established in this legislation, and I'm not going to let you sit here and say that it is not. Law enforcement, family, and household members will file a petition requesting that federal court issues these extreme risk protection orders, prohibiting individuals that are considered a threat to themselves or others from having access to purchasing or possessing firearms. If this legislation was not so important, why did the state of Florida enact it? Why did 18 other states enact it? Because they recognize that it is effective. They recognize that it is effective legislation, law that saves lives. So you can sit here and you can try to say whatever you want to say about, no due process. That is absolutely not the truth. This legislation has shown in many, many instances and all the research and data that has been established to substantiate that any state, and I heard something that was contradictory earlier, but states that actually have federal extreme risk protection orders or statewide orders have reductions, massive reductions in what are considered, fatal shootings and murders. So this legislation works, and we've seen it over and over again. We've seen this happen definitely by the governor of Florida. He established this right after Parkland. Of all
Will the
states.
gentlelady yield?
No, I will not.
Oh, no, this is your friend, Jamie Raskin.
Okay. Yes, I will yield. I will yield to my friend Jamie Raskin from Maryland. Thank you.
Thank you for your leadership and your passion, Ms. McBath. You are a model to us all. Look, when we point out that there are more guns than people in America and that we are awash in guns, our friends say, oh, well, the problem isn't guns, it's the people, despite the fact that we have rates of gun violence and gun homicide 20 times higher than the European countries. They say it's the people, okay? So the states then legislate to permit police officers and family members to petition a state court to order the temporary removal of firearms when someone is proven to be a danger to other people or to themselves. So you think our friends would say, okay, that's focused on the person. But no, of course, they oppose that because the NRA opposes all forms of gun regulation, all forms of gun safety legislation. And so they are categorically opposed to anything that we can do to try to lift this reign of terror across the country. Now, they claim it violates due process, but the police and family members can't seize the guns. You've got to go to court to do it. And the court, a neutral, impartial magistrate, hears the whole case. and then decides whether to temporarily remove them. So I think that this outrageous amendment brandishing their disrespect for the states that are actually doing something demonstrates the frivolity, the frivolousness of their whole approach to this. They're not going to do anything to get rid of assault weapons. They claim that that violates the Second Amendment, and then they won't do anything that allows the states to pass laws that actually try to target people who have proven themselves to be a danger to other people. So I thank you, Ms. McBath, for your leadership, and I yield back to you.
Gentlelady's time has expired. For what purpose is Mr. Jordan seeking
Strike
recognition?
the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The language in the gentleman's amendment is so accurate. Red flag laws trample on an individual's due process and Second Amendment rights. That is exactly what these laws do. All you got to do is look at the bill the Democrats passed last October. Last October, it defined who can file the petition to take away another individual's Second Amendment liberty. It says a family or household member. How is that defined? Parent, spouse, sibling, child related by blood, marriage, adoption. Second one, dating partner of the respondent. Think about that. Dating partner of the respondent. A woman breaks up, ends a relationship.
Yes. Yes.
Ex-boyfriend's
That's
married.
crazy. Yeah.
He says, I'll take her firearms from her. He goes to court, says she's crazy, shouldn't have a gun. There's a hearing within 24 hours. What kind of investigation can happen that quick? 24-hour hearing. He gets to remain confidential, the guy who's petitioning to take away someone else's Second Amendment liberty. He doesn't have to pay a fee. He just signs something, says she's crazy, she shouldn't have a firearm. There's a hearing within 24 hours, and guess what? She doesn't get to show up. It's an ex parte hearing. She doesn't even get to show up to defend herself. And what's the evidence? His word, the ex-boyfriend who's out to get her. And she can't have a firearm for 2 weeks under the Democrats' bill they passed last October. She can't have a firearm. Now, what if the scenario is even worse? What if it's a scenario we debated a few hours ago?
What if he
that
wants
Mr.
to harm
Massey brought
her?
up? What if he's intent on doing her harm?
Yes.
And he just knows he took away her ability to defend herself. That's what this bill would do. No due process. And for her to get it back, she has to go to court. And the standard, the evidence standard is lower, clear and convincing standard that she has to prove to get back her fundamental liberty, the Second Amendment right that she enjoys as an American citizen. That's why these things are so dangerous. You talk about, they're going to, Mr. Gates from Florida is so right. This is going to be abused. Probably
course it
already
will.
is in the states that have done it.
Of course it
We all
is.
want to keep weapons out of bad guys' hands, evil people with mental illness. But as Mr. Massey's pointed out, that's not what this is going to do. We know where this is headed. And Mr. Bishop brought up a great point. We've got to be careful about the awesome power of government to go after people. We've talked about this a lot in this committee, but we had an FBI whistleblower come forward, talk to us about what happened in this whole school board scenario, where they investigated a mom simply because she was in the group Moms for Liberty and had a gun. The FBI went and investigated her. This is a scary direction where the Democrats want to go. I hope we can adopt this amendment, send a message, frankly, to the United States Senate that this is not the way to go. You don't want a law, encouraging a law out there that's going to deprive people of due process and take away their Second Amendment liberties and then put the burden on them to go get back their rights. We don't want to go this direction. This is a good amendment. I hope we can adopt it. We'll yield to the gentleman from Kentucky.
Citizens don't want a world where police make unannounced pre-dawn raids and people lose their fundamental right to self-defense without a real judicial hearing. But guess who else doesn't want that world? Police don't want that world. There are sheriffs already who are refusing to implement these red flag laws because they put unnecessarily, just so somebody can prove a point, so somebody can get back at a domestic partner, they put police in the dangerous and unenviable situation where they have to wake up somebody in the morning unannounced that they know is armed, who has no idea why somebody's coming through their door, why somebody's busting that door down, why somebody is dragging them out and getting and trying to take away their firearms. The results are predictable, and they have happened. You're going to have people who die in the execution of these so-called warrants, the type of warrants that frankly would make King George blush. I think there was more due process there in the colonies when he infringed on their rights than what is being proposed here in red flag laws. And I urge, a lot of the water's already gone over the dam here in Congress. And that's going to be the case until this November when the people get a chance to speak. But in the meantime, it's up to the Senate. And these senators, they're out of touch. A lot of them are out of touch with their constituents, but also out of touch with the Constitution. I yield back to the gentleman from Ohio.
Red flag laws trample on an individual's due process and Second Amendment rights. So true. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Texas seek recognition?
To strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized.
First of all, let me announce that this may be well known. In Wisconsin at 2:26 Central Standard Time, the Racine Police Department told residents to stay away from Graceland Cemetery due to multiple shots fired. Multiple people injured in shooting at Wisconsin Cemetery. Multiple people were shot during a funeral as loved ones were paying their final respects to a 37-year-old man. There are victims, but unknown how many at this time, according to police. As we sit here, I'm not representing the extent of the details, but Mr. Chairman, as we sit here, there are multiple shots fired near Racine, Wisconsin. I'm not representing the gun type. The facts are still unfolding. And my colleagues are here arguing about saving lives. I don't take a back seat to the privileges of the Constitution and how valuable they are to the people of this nation. In my skin, I've had much of that denied over history. I was denied due process. I had property taken away. I was considered property in terms of the ancestors, formerly enslaved Africans. I know what the history speaks about denying rights.
So let's
But
not keep doing that.
Equate red flag laws that were supported by Senator Lindsey Graham in 2018 and that have been suggested that they will be supported by Republican senators in 2022, and then to compound the injury with the repetitive statement is that we're rushing ahead, we're doing things too fast, we're bullying. Well, none of that talk takes away guns out of a disturbed person's hands. The perpetrator in Buffalo was disturbed with the mental
He was not
disease
disturbed.
of white supremacy.
Like, stop it. That's not, stop playing games. That's not a mental illness.
No one knows whether or not
It's an ideology.
that attitude would equate to a red flag, but certainly was filled with evil and hatred. The perpetrator here in Uvalde had mountains of social media of murdering women and sexually abusing them, and disturbed 18-year-old. Who knows how much more? And by the way, if there had been a waiting period, 7 days, he might have not been able to do this dastardly deed. Maybe the grandmother might have been able to raise the issue with police. This provision in this bill on the red flag provides due process. It indicates that you can be in court within 72 hours. It indicates that if it's an ex parte order, you can still come to court. You have an opportunity for notice and to be heard. You're to be represented by counsel, or if you do not have the ability to do so, you will have a court-appointed counsel. This is not a fishing expedition. This is not to be utilized to attack persons and the court will determine that. This is not a roundup or a lassoing of people. This is not to get in the midst of disheveled and disagreed with lovers. How much more are we going to get that doesn't take guns off the street, doesn't stop 3-year-olds from being killed because guns are not stored, or students to be killed because guns are not stored, to not educate the American public about storage, to not educate the American people about trafficking, to not educate the American people about munitions, magazines, and to not educate the American people about the idea of the gun age being too low.
Why is 18 too low?
These red flag laws.
Why is 18 too low?
Save lives. And it is obscene. One mass shooting after another. And as we sit here and as we fiddle while Rome burns, as our house burns down while Rome burns, I, for one, will not accept it. Let us pass this bill to protect our children. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Roy seek recognition?
I'll video back, sorry. To speak on the amendment.
Gentleman is recognized.
I think he was
I appreciate
sleeping. I don't know.
Chairman.
Let's wake him up. Yield back.
Excuse me? Excuse me?
You need to turn your camera on.
My camera's on. Or
Now
what?
it is. Now we see it.
Well, the little shot there about sleeping, it's not my rules that allows this kind of crap of a proceeding. And that's what it is. Crap proceeding. When you give us 48 hours notice and we're dealing with stuff that we have planned and we got to figure that out and we have to honor commitments and then figure out flights to come back. And now we're availing ourselves of this crap technology where half the damn committee is voting at night in their pajamas and doing, Lord knows what. And then you want to accuse me of sleeping because I don't have my camera on? Give me a break. Let me tell you what this is all about. It's a pretext. This is all pretext. Democrats come in here saying, hey, we don't want to take your guns. And then they say, we want to take your guns. This bill, oh, come on, let's all work together. We're just going to do some soft changes to the laws. You can't disagree with that. But then they admit throughout the entire afternoon what their goal is: to get rid of semi-automatic weapons, to disarm the American people. That is the goal. It is a pretext, all of this, and we know it. That is the reality. And that is the reality and the basis behind what Mr. Gates is offering. A recognition of what the red flag process is all about. Pretext. Right now, under the Baker Act structure in states, if you've got a real issue with someone being a danger to society or himself or others, you can go down that road. You can in Texas, right? Go down that road and deprive them of liberty, but go in and go in front of a judge and say this person should be committed, and then haul them under Texas law, haul in the medical personnel, and then within 72 hours you have a follow-up hearing and all the things that flow from that. And let's talk about, if you're going to deprive liberty, well, then why don't you friggin', saddle up and deprive liberty and say, okay, we're going to say, here's an individual and we're going to commit you. And then under 922G4, the federal laws that I've prosecuted in the United States Attorney's Office, then you can be deprived of weapons for the period of time that you're committed. And I can't remember the law about how long after. But the reality is, let's have that conversation if you want to have that conversation. But to sit here and say that we don't know for sure that the red flag laws that are existent in 18 or 19 states, are they effective or are they not? I've read studies by leftist-leaning organizations. Mother Jones had a study in a database demonstrating not very much effectiveness. There are real questions about how they're implemented. There's very legitimate questions here about the bill on the floor in the House, about the authority of the federal government, the authority of Congress to be doing this in the first place. My friends on the other side of the aisle are critical of Mr. Gates for offering this because it's pointing to the states. Mr. Gates' response, I think appropriately, is saying, hey, I want to make a position that says I think this is a deprivation of rights, which is actually a federal authority and not something you just leave to the courts, and that you have a discussion about how those things are implemented. But that ought to be what we're talking about here. But my view on this is pretty simple. Every member of the other side of the aisle has made perfectly clear about what the goal is. It's to disarm the citizenry. And that is the actual objective. And so when we're talking about red flag laws, when we're talking about the size of the magazine, when we're talking about whether or not you've got weapons that are locked up and safe, that is the objective. And I'll yield to the gentleman from Florida if he wants the time.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. We heard from the gentlelady from Texas about the horrors of slavery and racism. And I do wonder whether or not there would be a racist application of some of these red flag laws. I don't know that we've really studied whether or not they are more likely to be granted in cases
Exactly.
of people of different ethnicities.
Even if he doesn't care,
I would suggest that's
there's no
one of the
doubt
reasons
it would
the
be.
gentlelady was actually making an argument, not opposing or not in favor of red flag laws, but likely opposing them. Given the propensity or the potential for them to be used in a racially misaligned way. And my colleague from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, talked about the great virtue of having magistrates make decisions in these red flag law cases, but he knows full well that that's not in an adversarial hearing. It's like being it's like applauding somebody for scoring an uncontested layup, which is it's the due process version of that. Our whole concept of due process relies on the paradigm of an adversarial process, and that's one of the many problems with this red flag system that seems to be adopted in some parts of the country. I see our time's expired, and I'll yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Is Mr. Raskin seeking recognition?
But I was actually going to ask my friend, Mr. Roy, a question, because he was.
Do you strike the last word?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
This is a really critical debate we're having right now, because I understood my colleagues to be saying, well, they couldn't support legislation against high-capacity magazines. These magazines were used both in Buffalo and Uvalde to dramatically increase the scope of the carnage. And so a number of states, including my state, have said, well, you don't need high-capacity magazines for hunting. You don't need high-capacity magazines to defend your home. You need them only if you want to use a weapon as a killing machine. And I don't know whether any of our colleagues want to suggest some perfectly lawful, safe, and constitutional way that somebody can use high-capacity magazines that would justify the mass murderers in Buffalo and Uvalde getting a hold of them. But in any event, they say they oppose any limits on that because that would violate the Second Amendment, even though the Supreme Court was perfectly clear in the Heller decision that the Second Amendment protects the right to have rifles for hunting and recreation. I concede that. I embrace that. That's fine. It protects the right of people to use weapons for self-defense in the home, the Supreme Court said in the Heller decision. Maybe someplace else as well. But it doesn't protect your right to have machine guns or tanks or nuclear weapons or semi-automatic weapons of war. And that common sense understanding, which is supported by around 90% of the American people.
Would the gentleman yield?
In just a moment, I will. That common sense understanding is perfectly consistent with what the Supreme Court said in the Heller decision, which is you've got a right to hunt and you've got a right to self-defense. You don't have a right to carry weapons of war into public schools or into city halls. You don't have a right to access that without a background check. So we're fighting for a universal violent criminal background check. And my colleagues are throwing up the Second Amendment as a smokescreen to protect their opposition to any reasonable gun safety regulation. Enough. That's what's killing America. You're confusing people by saying that somehow any form of gun safety regulation violates the Second Amendment. That's nonsense. That's bull. That's ridiculous.
Would the
And
gentleman
America
yield
needs to
for a
understand
question?
that. So, no, in just a moment, I want to get back to the red flag laws. So our colleagues say, well, no, we're not going to get rid of high capacity magazines. And they want weapons of war to be purchased by 18-year-olds, which is another notion rejected by the vast majority of the American people. But they say, no, you've got to leave the guns alone. The Second Amendment protects the guns. You've got to go after the people. And they talk about evil people and so on. Okay, so the states say if a person is proving to be an imminent danger to you, a girlfriend, to someone in the family, to themselves, you go to a court and you tell a judge, we're lifting a red flag. We're saying there's a danger. You can temporarily seize those weapons, and then the person can get into court 72 hours later, a week later, and they can prove that they're not a danger. But our colleagues say no to that. In other words, they want to make it impossible for us to pass any legislation that would advance public safety. And so everything that they talk about is a radical distraction from what needs to be done to save America from the nightmare of these massacres that are continuing right through this very hearing. It is a bloodbath. And I'm just ashamed to be part of a hearing where we have colleagues who get up and will talk about anything but what we can really do to stop it. We need a universal violent criminal background check. We've got to get rid of the high capacity magazines. Our two biggest recent massacres were of 18-year-olds who got an AR-15 and went and engaged in mass murder of children, or shoppers in a supermarket, and they want to continue to allow 18-year-olds to go out and buy an AR-15. That is not a serious approach to public policy or public safety. And
How many
you're not
18-year-olds aren't
a
murdering people?
serious understanding of what the Supreme Court has said about the Second Amendment. And I wish that you would stop trying to deceive people about what the Second Amendment says. And if we need to do a tutorial on Heller, let's do a tutorial on Heller. But anytime we have any
Can we get a
reasonable gun
tutorial on
safety-
due process?
The gentleman has the
Yes,
time, and his
yes.
time, gentleman's time has expired, in fact. For what purpose
I'm
does
happy-
Mr. Biggs seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and, I appreciate the visceral response of the last speaker. I think it was interesting to hear his level of agitation. Because I'm looking at the red flag law that was passed out of our committee last October. And there are multiple conflicting issues, I suppose one might say, with regard to due process. But what I found interesting is this ex parte order thing. That is always a very, very dicey piece of evidence for those of us who've actually tried cases, literally tried hundreds of cases. That is a very, very dicey issue. And here you're allowing an ex parte order. If a petitioner makes an avowal that that this person, that the respondent, ultimately to be the respondent, it poses a risk of imminent personal injury. But what is that based on? Either actual knowledge of an interaction between the petitioner and the respondent, or another individual. If the petitioner believes that somebody else is credible and reliable. So you get an ex parte order issued on hearsay by somebody. This is not like doing a search warrant, which would be done on a reliable informant by an officer. This is by John Doe on the street who ran into somebody in the bar who was telling him about so-and-so. And he said, well, they seem like a good guy. I felt like I could trust them. That's the kind of due process that ain't due. And it certainly isn't real process. With that, I'll yield to my friend from Florida, Mr. Gates.
Let the message from this committee hearing to Republican senators be astonishingly clear. If you back red flag laws as some reflexive response to some emotion that you have, you betray your voters. You are a traitor to the Constitution, the Second Amendment, the Fifth Amendment. You do nothing to make mass shootings less likely, and you put a target on the back of your constituents to be subject to bizarre proceedings that you wouldn't see in any other type of circumstance that has a profound impact on your rights. And these will be abused. They are being abused. I think there's some that would probably red flag some of your colleagues in the Senate. How long until the conversations about kicking Senator Hawley off of aircraft turn into conversations about taking his guns away? See, this isn't just about guns, it's about power. And what the Democrats want is to ensure that the government has the power to take your guns away without giving you due process. And shame on any Republican in the Senate that would pave the way to that type of deprivation of our liberty and our constitutional rights. I yield back to the gentleman from Arizona.
I wonder if the gentleman would further yield to me.
Yes, I will yield to you. please.
Thanks, sir. You know, earlier today, Mr. Jones said, "You will not stop us from passing this package bill. If the filibuster obstructs us, we will abolish it. If the Supreme Court objects, we will expand it. We will not rest until we've taken weapons of war out of our communities." Which weapons of war is the term of art Democrats have concocted. But every comment from the Democrats today, including the denial of the availability of a gun to a victim of domestic violence, bespeaks their desire to reject the core right entailed in the Second Amendment. If they'll abuse all those things,
Will the
as Mr.
gentleman yield?
Jones has said, would they abuse this?
Will the gentleman yield?
Would they use a red flag law and a favorable official in a jurisdiction like the ones who changed all the election rules in 2020? Would they use those people to go attack their political opponent's gun rights?
Will the gentleman
Would that
yield?
happen? I just don't understand why, you know, if they want you, they've told you who they are. If you're the Republican senators considering doing this, you have to know the context in which you're operating. That's the context. In that situation, you're being asked to say, okay, we'll cut due process for this fundamental right. I don't think you can do it.
Will the gentleman yield?
Time of the gentleman has expired. For what purposes, Mr. Cicilline seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
This is a radical position being offered by our friends on the other side of the aisle. They claim that we should support ensuring that people who are an imminent danger to themselves and others, such that they might commit mass murder, have a constitutional right to access a firearm, and to deny them that right would, quote, trample on an individual's due process and Second Amendment rights. You know who didn't have due process? You know who didn't have their constitutional right to life respected? The kids at Parkland and Sandy Hook and Uvalde and Buffalo, and the list goes on and on. So spare me the bullshit about constitutional rights.
Would the gentleman
Not
yield?
No, I will not yield, and I'm not going to yield for my entire 5 minutes, so don't ask again. So first of all, these risk protection
good for
orders
Miranda?
work. They ensure that people who are a grave danger to themselves or others don't have access to a firearm. This is an idea that, by the way, the former Republican president said, and I quote, "We must make sure that those judged to pose a grave risk to public safety do not have access to firearms. And that if they do so, those firearms can be taken through rapid due process. That's why I've called for red flag laws, also known as extreme risk protection orders." The former Republican president. The bill introduced by Senator Lindsey Graham. So this view of our Republican colleagues on this committee, that no matter how dangerous you are, no matter how much you've exhibited an intention to kill others or kill yourself, you should have unfettered access to a firearm because the Second Amendment guarantees it. That is nonsense. Risk protection orders are modeled after domestic violence statutes. They have due process. They have notice requirements, a right to a hearing, a right to contest the seizure of the firearm. That's the due process which exists. It's available in all the states that have these laws, which is why they've been upheld by courts when challenged. So this idea that there's no due process is baloney. There is due process. There is a process. It's been found to be constitutionally acceptable. And it's not a permanent removal from a firearm, as Mr. Jordan suggested. It's a temporary removal so that person doesn't slaughter and kill others or kill him or herself. We know they work, and I ask unanimous consent to introduce into record extreme risk laws save lives.
Without
A report
objection.
that details the many examples where individuals where the lives of individuals and others have been saved because of this temporary intervention in the face of evidence of harm. It is shocking that our Republican colleagues have been clamoring about due process of would-be killers, and yet they've never mentioned the deprivation of due process of victims of gun violence, the deprivation of life that families experience when people are slaughtered with a gun by someone who's seriously mentally ill and shouldn't have a firearm. Haven't heard one word about their constitutional right to remain alive in this country. And this notion that you can't take away a gun from a seriously dangerous person, even temporarily, even after a judge has a hearing and determines that that person's a danger, is shocking. It's radical. It's even a departure from most Republicans. And by the way, 90% of the American people support this legislation, 75% of gun owners. And the former president who was cheered at the NRA convention, cheered as a big cheer, he supports it. That was his statement I read. And the notion of someone could make up a false claim, people are required to testify under oath. There are penalties if you lie. And most states have protections that make it illegal to file a false petition. That's built into the statute. But what this really is gun manufacturers and gun salesmen and people who are here to say no matter what, everyone in America should have access to as many guns as they want, no matter what their condition is, no matter what they intend to do with it, no matter who they slaughter, because gun sales promote revenue. And the gun manufacturers don't want any limitations on it. And it's disgraceful to hear people on this committee who are charged with taking an oath and protecting the lives of the constituents they represent to argue that someone who is seriously mentally ill, who's presented that they are a danger to themselves or others if they have access to a firearm, that they have a constitutional right and it will trample on their rights if that seriously ill and dangerous person can't buy a gun and slaughter innocent people. That is horrifying. It's radical. They're wrong. And we should overwhelmingly reject this hideous, hideous amendment. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purposes, Mr. Massey seeks recognition?
I wish to speak on the amendment.
Gentleman is recognized.
I'd like to just summarize what we're doing here today and what's gone on, because this is the last amendment to a series of 6 bills. Republicans, through the course of 8 or 9 or 10 amendments here, we've done triage, trying to save the Constitution in the face of 6 bills that exhibit callous and wanton disregard for the Constitution, but also callous disregard for the safety of American citizens. What have we seen today throughout these amendments? Well, Republicans tried to defend due process. Democrats said no thanks. Republicans tried to establish what the Supreme Court has already established, that this is an individual right to keep and bear arms. Democrats, they don't even want people who need guns, who could use guns for their self-protection, to have them. They just don't want any guns anywhere. They would like to repeal the Second Amendment. We've tried to protect the rights of domestic violence victims, not just their rights to defend themselves, but their right not to be prosecuted for gun trafficking, for merely trying to obtain the means of self-defense. We tried to protect the rights of military families in an amendment that would keep these bills from affecting a spouse at home while a military member is deployed from being able to defend herself. We've tried to protect draft age adults. We've heard them be insulted here, that their brains aren't fully developed. But yet we need them. We need to be able to conscript them into service our country, to defend a Constitution that's being shredded here today and whose rights they will not be able to enjoy, because although some here have decided their brains aren't fully formed, they've decided they can go fight for us. We've tried all of these things, but what's the one thing we haven't done? We have not talked about what would really fix this problem. What could we do to solve this problem? Look, the depraved individuals, by the way, we're having this hearing presumably as a knee-jerk reaction to shootings that have recently happened. But What are these depraved individuals, what's going through their minds? Is a Safe Storage Act going to change, whether they carry this out or not? No, a lot of them use straw purchasers. A lot of them steal their guns. We're not going to be able to keep them from getting guns, but what's going through their heads? They don't care to die. Once you've decided you don't care to die, you don't care about any of the laws you're going to break. You're going to violate all of them. What do they want? They have some distorted, grotesque image of what would make them famous.
Will the gentleman yield?
No, I will not. If they could go rack up a body count on a soft target, I mean, they even pick elementary schools instead of picking junior highs or high schools because there's likely not a resource officer there. We need to deprive them of that. They are copycats. They see this in the news, and that's what they seek to do. How do you keep them from that? There should be no honor. There should only be shame. They should be met with certain and unceremonious death if they target our children. Instead of advertising our children as soft targets, where nobody in that institution, not even qualified individuals, can carry a firearm to protect these kids. Sane adults should be able to protect kids from insane individuals. If we had this sign instead at the schools, attention, all this, please be aware that the staff are armed and may use whatever force necessary to protect our students. If that were the sign, which do you think the shooter is going to choose? Which of these two schools? Which of the two signs? You don't have to guess. The data is in. Every school that displays this sign, none of them have ever had a shooting. And here we are 32 years later since the first knee-jerk reaction, the 1990 Gun-Free School Zone Act, which was going to keep guns out of schools. It hasn't prevented a single shooting ever, and it has caused loss of life of students, young students, and teachers. And I will yield to my friend from Florida.
We only have a few seconds, but to just address this concept of rapid due process.
Right.
Like when we call for rapid due process
Abbreviated.
at the border, you tell us that can't happen at all. But then you want rapid due process to take guns away from Americans? Like, I don't think the American people really understood the bargain they were getting when they voted for Democrats and figured out they would have a party in power that would take guns away from the American people and then ship an endless supply of guns to Ukraine. Yield back.
The time of the gentleman has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't understand. My colleagues on the other side, they talk about one of the ways to fight gun violence is to take care of the mental health issues of the gunmen who kill Americans. We can take care of their mental health issues, and we can arm our teachers. That seems to be their only solution. But yet, when we talk about common sense, front end mental health assistance, they don't want to fund it, nor do they want to protect our children from people, particularly 18-year-olds, who are exhibiting the kind of conduct that warrant an intervention in advance before they do something to kill our students. And so I don't understand the, I don't understand, that's a contradiction. And really what we're getting today is a lot of spurious arguments and amendments to try to defeat this common sense legislation offered so as to score points with Wayne LaPierre, the executive director of the NRA. After all, back in 2014, we know that the NRA spent $103 million in contributions to politicians who protect and preserve its ability to dictate policy. In 2015, almost $100 million. I don't know what the figures are for 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020. I do know that the Attorney General for New York, Letitia James, filed a civil lawsuit against the NRA and Wayne LaPierre for wearing $4,000 suits. I admired the one that he had on at the down in Houston the other day, and it goes on. He charters yachts and brings the whole family, cruises to the Bahamas, just misspending whatever money comes into his grasp. And he was sued by the Attorney General and had to declare bankruptcy. But now it seems like they're rolling in dough again, and he's watching and he's approving of the performance of my friends on the other side of the aisle. I think the American people see through it. They want common sense gun reform, and they want it now. And with that, I'm going to yield to my colleague from the great state of Georgia, who has been trying to get a red flag law passed through this Congress, and I hope that she's at some point successful in doing so. My colleague from Georgia, Representative Lucy McBath.
Thank you so much to my colleague from Georgia. Thank you so much. I'm so sorely disappointed in my Republican colleagues as they just spew fear and hypothetical scenarios of ambushes in the dead of night. And to my Republican colleague in Florida, I resent your threats of one being a traitor and supporting red flag laws.
I was describing Republican senators.
Okay, let's just, okay. So anyway, let's just talk facts right now. It varies between 77% or 97% of the American public really supports red flag laws, either stateside or federal extremist protection orders. Between 1999 and 2021, at least 16,857 extremist protection petitions were filed. The majority of these petitions have been filed since the Parkland shooting, and might I add, 8,162 in Florida alone. Use of these life-saving laws did not stop during COVID-19. There were at least 8,114 petitions filed across the country in 2020 and 2021. I'm not going to talk anymore. I'm not going to spew any more statistics, but I will say this as a human being, as a mother, no longer talking as a legislator, I'm talking just for real. You walk a day in my shoes and you talk to the hundreds of family members and law enforcement and survivors who knew in advance that their loved ones were in crisis, and there was nothing that they could do. Their hands were tied. And I am out of time. If any of my colleagues would be more than happy to use time, I appreciate it.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Rise in support of the amendment.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. This has been really difficult to listen to, and I've been listening to the whole thing. And I wanted to be there in person, but the airline was not cooperative. So look, you're protected because of the laws that keep us from being liable for the things that we say in hearings. So when we are accused of wanting dangerous people to have guns, we can't sue for slander. There are just so many ridiculous things that is so slanderous, except you're protected because we're in a hearing. But it's outrageous. Misrepresenting what we've said that's on the record. And listen, as far as the red flag laws, yeah, I recall back during the Obama administration when, oh, everybody's in favor of red flag laws. Oh, everybody supports them. Yeah, and in fact, if you can't fly, you shouldn't get a gun. We heard that over and over, and a lot of people bought it because it wasn't explained what some of us knew. we were begging the Obama administration in writing and orally, tell us what gets someone put on the no-fly list, like a three-star general in my district repeatedly was. He's a national treasure and a national hero. They couldn't explain it. Maybe somebody had a name like his. We couldn't find out. Members of Congress, we couldn't find out how you got on the no-fly list or how you got off. But these are the same, some of the same people who are saying, oh, you got nothing to worry about red flag. You know, it's due process. You never get to know what the process was, but trust us, it was due process when you got put on the no-fly list and now you can't get off. You can't have a hearing. Look, as a judge, I heard evidence, I had hearings, and if somebody knows somebody else is dangerous, I had those hearings. And I ordered, in most cases, when the evidence was there, yes, this person's dangerous. This person is a threat to himself and to others. You can do that. I've done it. I've ordered it so that they wouldn't have a firearm. That can be done right now in Texas, I know, because that's where I was a judge.
Was the gentleman ill? Was the gentleman ill?
No. I've listened to all the slander that I care to listen to, and I'm telling you, this is outrageous what we've been listening to, and I need more time because Democrats keep interrupting. But
Mr. Gomer, Mr. Gomer?
you won't allow the red flag laws to be reasonable and to have due process, then this is my time. Then this should not pass until we have bills that we can review and see exactly where they're going and what they're taking away. And I yield the remainder of my time to my friend from Ohio, Mr. Jordan.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. The other side is talking about rapid due process. What is rapid due process? We know because they outlined it in their bill last fall. It is a hearing where the person who's going to lose their Second Amendment rights is not allowed to be present at. The petitioner can be there. They sign a statement, but the person losing their rights can't confront their accuser. They don't know who filed the petition. Rapid due process is going to lead to the suspension of people's rights. But the gentleman from Rhode Island said, don't worry. Don't worry. It's just temporary. Your rights are there some of the time, I guess, is what they think the Constitution says. It's just temporary. You can get them back, we promise. That is not how it works. This is a fundamental liberty, the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution, the Second Amendment in the Bill of Rights. And they say, oh, don't worry, you can get it back after we implement rapid due process. Rapid due process, by definition, is not due process. So the gentleman from Florida is exactly right. This is an assault on the Fifth Amendment, an assault on the Second Amendment. But Democrats say not to worry. It's just temporary. We promise we won't go further, even though they've said in today's hearing, this is just the start. We're not finished with this legislation. That is what is so frightening.
15 days to slow the spread.
Yes. Thank the gentleman for yielding. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Move to strike, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman is recognized.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought a few comments ago I heard Mr. Massey express a concern that straw purchases contribute to the gun violence epidemic. And I would just ask, sir, have you read the legislation that we are voting out of committee today? I mean, this is legislation that would ban straw purchases.
Actually, the legislation makes a domestic violence victim subject to prosecution for gun trafficking.
Nowhere in the legislation, sir, does it say that. And I would encourage, I mean,
you voted against an amendment that would have prevented it.
Sir, will you point to the provision that you're talking about that would criminalize victims of domestic violence?
It criminalizes everybody unless they're a family member in order to transfer a firearm.
All right, look, reclaiming my time here. This legislation would ban straw purchases of the kind that you claim to be concerned with.
They are already banned.
Reclaiming my time, sir. Reclaiming my time. And so this goes to the heart of the matter, which is that you guys are trying to avoid taking any responsibility whatsoever for the role that your inaction and your opposition to what we are trying to do today has played in continuing the status quo. I also want to, I also want to address another issue that has come up today, because I don't want to allow my Republican colleagues to claim that gun violence prevention is a state or local issue. The truth is, our gun laws are only as strong as our weakest state's laws. We need to set a federal floor for that reason. The people of my home state of New York pay the lethal price for the reckless policies of GOP states across the country. 76% of traced guns used in crimes that cross state lines came from states without background check laws. For New Yorkers, that means the, quote, iron pipeline. Guns smuggled up the I-95 corridor from the south. In New York City, 90% of guns recovered at a crime scene came from out of state. So gun violence doesn't respect state or city borders. In New York City, that means children shot and killed walking around their neighborhoods. Earlier, I told you about the fear that I felt as an 11-year-old when I learned about the Columbine shooting, miles and miles away. So just imagine the life-altering fear and pain for the friends of Kahara Tay, an 11-year-old shot and killed in New York City last month. Their friend, who they called Kiki, has been taken from them, all because Congress wouldn't do a thing about the flood of illegal guns in New York City. This tale is all too familiar across New York. In January, an 11-month-old baby in the Bronx was struck by a stray bullet. In April, 12-year-old Cade Lewin was shot and killed in Brooklyn while sitting in a car with his mother, eating a meal. Kids across New York City are being killed, and I'm not gonna stand for that, not while I'm in Congress. We will not fail the children of New York City, for Kiki or for Cade, and we will not fail the 29 New Yorkers injured when someone who should never have been near a gun in the first place fired a handgun 33 times in a subway car, stopping in Sunset Park. We will not fail them. We have a moral duty not to fail them. With that, I'd like to yield to my distinguished colleague from the great state of Georgia, Lucy McBath.
Thank you so very much. I appreciate that. And as I was just saying before, and I'm just going to say this very briefly, I'm talking to you now not as a legislator. I'm talking to you as a gun violence survivor who spends a lot of time and days and hours and months and weeks talking to others like myself, talking to other individuals across the country who recognize that their loved ones were in crisis, who recognized that their loved ones needed help, who recognized that their loved ones had access to firearms and ammunition and had no recourse, no legal recourse whatsoever to protect their loved ones from themselves or them doing bodily harm to others in their community. Walk a day in my shoes when I have to sit there and listen to the stories over and over again from law enforcement who even said that their hands are tied. Walk a day in my shoes. You can spew all the hypotheticals that you want, but until you live those experiences, don't you dare try to tout that red flag does not work. The statistics, the data is there to substantiate the need for these laws to save as many lives as we can. Walk a day in my shoes. Don't you dare ever sit here and try to just hypothetically scare people with scenarios and fear-mongering. Don't you dare. The American people deserve far better than this, and they deserve to have their lives cared for, which you seem to know nothing about.
Mr. Chairman, can I
Time of the
make a
gentleman has expired. For what purposes, Mr. Ben seek recognition?
Strike the last word, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, I came into this hearing hoping that we would focus on something that we could do to help the kids in our schools, something that we could do right now, something that would not take years of debate, something that would actually help. And there's been a number of amendments that have been suggested, but before I turn my attention to those, let me walk down through why that which is being suggested by my Democrat colleagues won't immediately help. The first 18 to 21, constitutionally suspect. Ghost guns, constitutionally suspect. Storage, prohibiting immediately access to self-defense, constitutionally suspect. Bump stocks already banned, but constitutionally suspect. The large magazine minimization of those without consequence from a practical standpoint, anybody that knows anything about those types of guns. The gun trafficking thing, flawed. Okay, but each one of these will not help now. These things will be challenged and nothing's going to happen for our kids. What disturbs me the most about what I've seen today is the failure of my Democrat colleagues to reach out to we Republicans who had a list of bills that you should have worked into what we're looking at today. Richard Hudson's Stop 2 Act, which is labeled Secure Every School, Protect Our Kids. The HR 1518, the 21st Century NICS Act by Tom Rice. HR 194, DOJ report on NICS prosecutions by Representative Michael Burgess. HR 1604, Stop Straw Purchases Act by Don Bacon. HR 1642, Prosecuting Gun Crime Saves Lives Act by Nicole Malatukas. HR 1567, Police Officers Protecting Children's Act, Vicky Hartzler. HR 1229, the Eagles Act. HR 750, the Luke and Alex School Safety Act. Not a peep about these. So if there's any indication of what this truly is, which is a political gesture at best and a sad, sad commentary on our inability to get something done at worst, a really sad commentary, that failure to incorporate that which we Republicans with in good faith suggesting bills that already exist truly is. And I want to go back to the list of amendments. There were 3, the retired officers, the RSO, and the school safety, that would have done something right now. And there could be any number of things that would allow us to go into our schools and make them safer. Right now, not with things being challenged in court, as will be the case, why our kids suffer. I have to say, I've never heard so much with so little accomplished truthfully in my life, and I've heard a lot of stuff. But I'm going to yield to Louis Gohmert.
Would the gentleman here, please?
Yeah.
Yielding to gentleman from Texas, Louis Gohmert.
Yeah, and I would like to, I didn't realize Burgess was seeking time earlier, but let me just mention 60% of voters, Republican and Democrat, believe that preventing properly trained school teachers and school staff from carrying a firearm makes schools more dangerous. And yet you wouldn't even let us get close to passing that. If I can, I'd like to yield my time to Burgess that I slighted earlier without realizing.
That's okay. I won't take so much time, but I just, this has been an interesting hearing. I don't know if it's a matter of self-awareness or arrogance. My friend from New York was blaming the rest of the country for what's happening in New York. Now, what's happening in New York, what's happening in Chicago is because of policies. And we see poor people run through every single day with no protection, and every single week we have 50 to 60 people being shot and nothing's being said. I see this remarkable emotion from the other side about what's happening. Well, we should. But we're having this every single week in Black neighborhoods, in Hispanic neighborhoods, where people are not safe because they cannot protect themselves. And now we want to take this process, this failed policy, and let the rest of the country deal with this misery. Misery should never be a political strategy. And what I'm seeing right now in these urban communities is nothing but misery. So people are hopeless. They're waiting for somebody to come in and help them out, and they go to big government to do it. Well, how about this? Give everybody person the right, like we've been given in our Constitution, to protect themselves. And I'll bet you give people right, teach them how to use their arms, teach them what safety is all about, and we will not have the issues we're having in these urban cities today that we have today. So this is something we need to change. I cannot wait till 2023 so we can start giving people the rights to protect, give them the basic constitutional rights to protect themselves.
Thank you, Mr. Ben.
The gentleman's time, the time of the gentleman has expired. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I ask to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Just a few final random thoughts. I am glad that we're here, that we have the courage to make sure that we bring this bill to the floor, that we get through this markup, as despicable as much of it has been. I just want to remember what the Second Amendment says, because it's been awfully idolized in this strange set of ways from our colleagues on the other side of the aisle. The Second Amendment reads, a well-regulated militia, comma, being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, comma, shall not be infringed. Do you think the founding fathers were picturing AR-style weapons, Glocks?
Is it really another comma?
This has to do with a well-regulated militia. These were the founding days of our country, a very different time. I think they'd be ashamed of the arguments they heard today. Some of the words that offended me, and I wonder how parents in this room who have struggled and suffered from gun violence felt each time folks on the other side of the aisle said, oh, the Democrats, it's just a knee-jerk reaction. 23 years after Columbine, knee-jerk? Oh, rush to this markup. 23 years after Columbine, hundreds of thousands of students terrorized, terrified, thousands wounded or killed. I wonder how this sounds to a parent who's lost a child. Mrs. Song, I honor that you are here today, and your son Ethan has been here the entire time, witness to this. And I hope, and I know how proud he is of you and your colleague and the work that you are doing to bring the truth to the American people. The other thing that strikes me about this conversation is how glib the folks on the other side of the aisle are about the Constitution, Second Amendment, Fifth Amendment, due process. Do you notice what's missing from their conversation for these many hours? Is any recognition of the slaughter in this country and our responsibility to do something about it. Why were you elected to office? Why did you seek this position? If it wasn't to save lives, to lift up those less fortunate, to shield our children from the terrorizing of those crazy posters. Must be fun to walk into schools that have those warnings up. Think of the children in Uvalde who walked out of that classroom. Think of what they saw and will never be able to erase from their minds. I invite my colleagues to visit the work of 97%, an organization that collects data from gun owners, bipartisan folks who own guns, don't own guns, Democrats, independents, Republicans. As I said earlier today, you are out of touch. You're out of touch with the American people. The American people are offended at our failure to act. And I bet they are offended by your absence of showing any compassion for the loss of life. It makes me wonder, do you have children? Do you have grandchildren? Do you worry for them that the next phone call might be something that happened to one of them? We are at a crossroads. We've been here before, but we're at a crossroads yet again. And kind of like Robert Frost, I hope we finally take the one less traveled by and act. Act to save lives from this public health crisis of our own making. I asked the Senate, unlike my colleague who tried to threaten the Senate, I asked the Senate, please stop sitting on your hands. Please stop hiding behind the filibuster. Please have the courage to save lives. And I end by saying thank you, Mr. Chairman. When we started in the majority 4 years ago, what was the first hearing you had? Gun violence. After 2 decades of nobody wanting to have a hearing on it. So I thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're going to get this done with or without our Republican colleagues' help. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Ms. Escobar seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Here we are over 7 hours into the debate over our efforts on gun violence prevention. Today provided the Republicans on the committee an opportunity to offer constructive ideas on how to keep American school children, shoppers, hospital employees safe. Frankly, how to keep our citizens alive in the face of horrific gun violence. So what are my Republican colleagues' ideas? I'll give you 2 examples. Their amendments have included an attempt to completely gut our effort to raise the ownership age from 18 to 21 for ownership of some of the deadliest weapons. A bill, by the way, a law that would have prevented the carnage in Uvalde. And another amendment to prevent us from having red flag laws altogether. That's the current amendment we're debating. In fact, they've used this entire day's debates to try to expand access to guns and prevent the common sense solutions that Americans are demanding of us. Yes, they're standing in the way to let us do our job, so that we can deliver to the American people what they are demanding of us. Fellow Americans, here are the facts. There's one political party in America standing up for the victims of gun violence. There's one political party in America voting for common sense solutions that could prevent some of the carnage we've suffered from. There's only one political party in America that wants to protect law enforcement from weapons that leave them outgunned. And that's the Democratic Party. And there's one political party in America standing in the way of those solutions, solutions that would make our children safer time and again. And that's the Republican Party. When, not if, the next shooting makes the headlines, when the next shooting takes the lives of innocent children, husbands, wives, grandparents, siblings, it's time for Americans to ask themselves when enough is finally enough. And they need to ask themselves if they are finally outraged enough to hold those who stand in the way of their safety accountable. Believe what they do, not what they say. And remember, they care more about feeding the extremism that is radicalizing our country than they do about saving lives. They won't stop until they try to arm every teacher, every nurse, every doctor, every grocery store worker. The absurdity of their extremism is deadly. Mr. Chairman, I'm ready to take action once again, and we'll see who votes in favor of safety and who doesn't. Take note, America. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The question occurs on the amendment, the nature of on the amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, no? No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
I request a roll call.
Recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler?
No.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren?
No.
Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson Lee? No. Ms. Jackson Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen?
No. So it's not showing.
Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Johnson of Georgia?
No.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Deutsch?
No.
Mr. Deutsch votes no. Ms. Bass?
Nope.
Ms. Bass votes no.
No.
Mr. Jeffries?
No.
Mr. Jeffries votes no. Mr. Cicilline?
No.
Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu? Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Jayapal?
No.
Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Stimmings?
No.
Ms. Stimmings votes no. Mr. Correa? Ms. Scanlon?
No.
Ms. Scanlon votes no. Ms. Garcia?
No.
Ms. Garcia votes no. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Ms. McBath?
No.
Ms. McBath votes no. Mr. Stanton?
No.
Mr. Stanton votes no. Ms. Dean?
No.
Ms. Dean votes no. Ms. Escobar?
No.
Ms. Escobar votes no. Mr. Jones?
No.
Mr. Jones votes no. Ms. Ross?
Ross votes no.
Ms. Ross votes no. Ms. Bush? Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Shabbat?
Aye.
Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Gomert?
Aye.
Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Isa?
Aye.
Mr. Isa votes aye. Mr. Buck?
Aye.
Mr. Buck votes aye. Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Biggs?
Aye.
Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. McClintock?
Aye.
Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Stube?
Yes.
Mr. Stube votes yes. Mr. Tiffany?
Tiffany, aye.
Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Mr. Massey?
Aye.
Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Roy?
Aye.
Mr. Roy votes aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes aye. Ms. Fishbach?
Fishbach votes aye.
Ms. Fishbach votes aye. Ms. Sparts? Mr. Fitzgerald?
Aye.
Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye. Mr. Bentz?
Best votes aye.
Mr. Bentz votes aye. Mr. Owens?
Owens aye.
Mr. Owens votes aye.
Mr. Chair, how am I recorded?
Mr. Liu, you are not recorded.
I vote no.
Mr. Liu votes no.
Madam Chair.
Mr. Correa, you are not recorded.
Correa votes no.
Mr. Correa votes no. Mr. Swalwell, you are not recorded.
No.
Mr. Swalwell votes no.
Are there any other members who have not been recorded or wish to be recorded? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 18 ayes and 24 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. For what purpose does Ms. Jackson Lee seek recognition?
Chairman, I have
Put on your mic.
submissions into the record, which I'd like to list very quickly. The millions of Americans who are supporting the Protect Our Kids Act include, as an consent, the National Education Association, the American Medical Association, the National Alliance of Specialized Instructional Support, the Organization of American Federation of Teachers, and the Major City Chiefs. They support the legislation and on the elements of the bills that are in the legislation. I ask unanimous consent to submit into the record.
Without objection. The question,
I'd like to submit into the record the number of AR-style rifles that were produced in the millions opposed to 2004 assault weapons expiration, and millions were produced at that time after the expiration. Ask unanimous consent. Ask unanimous consent of the number of mass shooters under 21 since 1982, 14% are of that age group. Ask
Without
unanimous
objection.
consent. Ask unanimous consent for an excerpt of the Heller case indicating the lack of prohibition on limitations on gun use. Ask
Without
unanimous
objection.
consent. And then I ask unanimous consent to show the list of children and others that died because of the lack of storage laws to protect children as young as 3 years old from being killed or injured. Ask unanimous consent.
without objection.
And then finally, pages and pages of Americans who have died in mass shootings, including those who have died from Buffalo, from Atlanta, El Paso, and of course Uvalde. Ask unanimous consent.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose does Mr. Roy seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word on the ANS.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank the chairman. Look, the problem with politicians, especially in DC, is that they tell the American people that we can protect them from harm, protect them from every aspect of evil, from every tragedy. That we're never going to let a bad thing happen again. And the people on this committee say effectively today that they can stop evil, that we must do something. But they've admitted here multiple times by multiple parties that it's all a pretext to ban weapons. If this were about policy, if it really were, we'd be addressing facts, right? 2% of prosecuted federal criminals have bought their weapons through retail purchases, less than or just over 10% of state criminals. About 0.8% of criminals obtained their weapons at a gun show. Crime in San Francisco is facing a recall vote of the DA. Why? Police making arrests and only 8% of crimes reported there. Homicides are up 36%. 2021 arson is up 40% compared to 2019. In San Antonio, crime is skyrocketing. Cops won't even refer to the DA drug crimes because they won't prosecute them. In Chicago, why isn't the U.S. attorney and the DA there focusing on straw purchases and other crimes to address the 800 plus homicides? Straw purchases are already a crime for people who are prohibited from owning a firearm. Police have been verifiably defunded in Austin to the tune of $150 million. We have 107,000 deaths and skyrocketing from fentanyl pouring across our border. Thousands and thousands of Americans. We have documented homicides by hands and knives more than rifles. I say that again. Hands and knives documented homicides are greater than rifles. We have a cultural rot in this country. Yet this legislation focuses on targeting law-abiding Americans. It would make it baseline unlawful to obtain a gun for a non-family member, friend, or acquaintance, regardless of their eligibility, like current law requires. Maybe a spouse of a military service member, like my friend from Kentucky mentioned. It would make me a criminal several times over, living as I do today. For example, here I've got in this room actually a 20 gauge single shot shotgun and a 22 lever action. I've got these right here. And I have them sitting here in the room out, exposed. Why? So I can go kill a snake. So I can go kill a coyote. So I can go do what I need to do, kill things, because that's what guns are for. I've got both of those guns and I've had them since I was 9 years old. And you know what? My children who are under the age of 18, they know that those guns are to be used only to go kill a snake, to go kill a coyote, to go protect their dog if it's being chased down or tracked down. That's why we have guns. And you're saying if I leave my 20 gauge or 22 sitting out and I have a 12-year-old son and I don't have that locked up, oh gosh, sorry, we got a coyote. Let me go get the key to go unlock it. That is straight up bullshit, quote Mr. Cicilline. That's what it is. And that's what you're doing to the American people. Look, now you've got part of the provision that says you're going to set the age. We've already had a robust debate about that. I got a 45 when I was 18 years old. I guess I somehow managed to get through. The fact here is this is really about the left's culture war against gun owning and supporting Americans. That's what it's about. And it's about refusing to acknowledge the fundamental reason and the purpose for the Second Amendment. This is not specifically about hunting or self-defense, but even defense against tyranny. I don't accept the term weapon of war regarding the AR-15. It's not. It's used for hunting primarily. It's the most popular rifle. But even if it were, depriving the American people of the weapon, the stated goal of most or all committee Democrats today, and the target of magazines greater than 10 in this very bill to do so, then what are the citizens supposed to do if the government is tyrannically trampling their rights? What are we supposed to do? What should Americans do if the government, in conjunction with, say, international organizations, attempt to lock us in apartment buildings like they do in China to stamp out COVID? What do the American people do? In history, this is replete with examples. The Soviet Union established gun control, and from 1929 to 1953, they massacred 20 million people. Turkey, the Armenians, 1.5 million people. We know about Germany and gun control and what it meant for Jews and in that part of the world, in Germany and Austria, Poland, and throughout Europe. We have China establishing gun control in 1935, and another 20 million people were massacred. Evil is evil. And what do we know about the Uvalde shooter? It was a psychotic, evil 18-year-old who talked about raping women, killing defenseless animals, and was willing to gun down fourth graders. We have a cultural rot in this country. We're stripping the dignity of work, the role of fathers in raising sons, the abuse of drugs, the missing community to stop a boy from being MIA from school, not working while sitting around playing Call of Duty and abusing animals. In order to seek the American people, tell American people a lie, that the government will protect them. Half of this committee is willing to take away a citizen's God-given right to protect himself or herself from harm, and importantly, from the very tyranny being applied to them to deny that right. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I recognize myself on the ANS. I'll be very brief. I won't use my 5 minutes. I'll simply express my shock at what I just heard from Mr. Roy. When he talked about using guns to fight tyranny, he's talking about turning guns on American troops. Turning guns, we ought to be able to shoot American troops. I find that shocking. I yield back and I recognize Mr. Issa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. Mr.
Gentleman is
Chairman,
recognized.
thank you. Mr. Chairman, I haven't spoken here today. I've listened for these 8 hours. And now in my 22nd year since I came here in January 2001, I have to say that what I found missing from the debate today was some sort of legitimacy to the dialogue about could we find common ground? Quite candidly, Mr. Shattuck, I'm doing great here, Shabbat, he said very well, I can find common ground, would you consider it? And I heard no consideration. Many of the members made it clear that there were some aspects to this that they could deal with, but not the combination of all of these bills. I certainly think that there was a very well orchestrated opening statement by the ranking member that made it clear that some of what is in this bill is before the courts, and the current rulings are not favorable to the way this legislation is written. None of this seems like anything other than it's an election year, a terrible tragedy, multiple tragedies have happened. And so let's look not at the 86% of mass shootings that involve people over 21, but let's look at that 14% that involve young people under 21, and let's have a bill for that. Let's look at a weapon, the AR-15 or similar, and let's try to live in the glory that we had in the 90s when it was previously banned, even though the court has ruled that it wasn't a particularly constitutional move. The list goes on. I won't reiterate it. It's been a very long day for everyone. I'm going to join the chorus of Republicans and say this. If you want to have sensible gun reform, particularly if you want to protect our children, if you want to protect our schools, if you want to have the kinds of reform that you say you want to have, then let's have a dialogue bill by bill, item by item. And if we do that, at least we won't have so many statements made as to the intent. And I heard it on both sides, the intent of one versus the other. Mr. Chairman, I do not believe that your motives are anything other than trying to find solutions. Mr. Jordan, I don't believe your motives are anything but wanting to find solutions. I'm deeply saddened that we didn't find solutions here today, that every single vote came down on party lines. I hope the next time we have a markup on a bill, the next time we even have a hearing on a bill, that we will all do better. With that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your indulgence.
Would you yield,
and
Mr.
I yield
Issa?
back.
Mr. Issa, would you please yield for a question?
Of course, I would yield.
I
Sure.
thank you so very much. I think one of the challenges that we have, and I just raise it as an inquiry, we have the loved ones of dead Americans who've died at the hands of gun violence and died at the hands of perpetrators who may have mental illness. But let me not characterize it, because that's a small percentage. But there are families, there are parents who are mourning. They need answers. These are well thought out initiatives, and I would hope you would consider them.
Reclaiming my time, I think this is where Mr. Massey was repeatedly accurate in giving us facts and figures on what we would or would not accomplish here. So hopefully when Mr. Massey is in the majority, or at least in a position to be heard and respected, those facts will be put out front, and any solutions will be based on the numbers as they really are. And that's not to take away from the grieving families, But there are families today that are not grieving because some law-abiding citizen had a weapon and protected that family. And that is a balancing act that we have, as a nation, balanced on the Second Amendment since our founding, and it has lasted us over 245 years. And to that, I would celebrate that that balance must be maintained. And I thank all the members for their participation, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended. This will be followed immediately by a vote on final passage of the bill. All those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair,
No.
the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. Reporting quorum being present. The question is on the motion to report the bill HR 7910 as amended favorably to the House. Those in favor respond by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. And the bill is ordered reported. Roll call vote is requested, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler.
Yes.
Mr. Nadler votes yes. Ms. Lofgren.
Yes.
Ms. Lofgren votes yes. Ms. Jackson Lee.
Yes.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes yes. Mr. Cohen.
Yes.
Mr.
Yes.
Cohen. Mr. Cohen votes yes. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
Yay.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes yes. Mr. Deutsch.
Aye.
Mr. Deutsch votes aye. Ms. Bass.
Yes.
Ms. Bass votes yes. Mr. Jeffries.
Aye.
Mr. Jeffries votes aye. Mr. Cicilline.
Aye.
Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Swalwell.
Aye.
Mr. Swalwell votes aye. Mr. Liu.
Aye.
Mr. Liu votes aye. Mr. Raskin. Mr. Raskin. Mr. Raskin.
I vote yes.
Mr. Raskin votes yes. Ms. Jayapal.
Aye.
Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Stimmings.
Aye.
Ms. Stimmings votes aye. Mr. Correa. Ms. Scanlon.
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Ms. Garcia.
Absolutely yes.
Ms. Garcia votes yes. Mr. Neguse.
Aye.
Mr. Neguse votes aye. Ms. McBath.
Aye.
Ms. McBath votes aye. Mr. Stanton.
Aye.
Mr. Stanton votes aye. Ms. Dean.
Aye.
Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Escobar. Ms. Escobar votes aye. Mr. Jones.
Aye.
Mr. Jones votes aye. Ms. Ross.
Ross votes aye.
Ms. Ross votes aye. Ms. Bush. Mr. Jordan. Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Shabbat.
No.
Mr. Shabbat votes no. Mr. Gomert.
No.
You're gorgeous. Mr. Gomert votes no. Mr. Isa.
No.
Mr. Isa votes no. Mr. Buck.
No.
Mr. Buck votes no. Mr. Gates. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana.
No.
Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Biggs.
No.
Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock.
No.
Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Stube.
No.
Mr. Stube votes no. Mr. Tiffany.
Tiffany, no.
Mr. Tiffany votes no. Mr. Massey. Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Roy.
Awakening from my slumber to vote no.
Mr. Roy votes no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes no. Ms. Fishbach?
No.
Ms. Fishbach votes no. Ms. Sparts? Ms. Sparts?
Sparts, no.
Ms. Sparts votes no. Mr. Fitzgerald?
Sparts votes
Mr. Fitzgerald?
No.
Mr. Fitzgerald votes no. Mr. Benz?
Mr. Benz votes no.
Mr. Benz votes no. Mr. Owens?
Owens, no.
Mr. Owens votes no. Mr. Gates, you are not recorded. Mr. Gates votes no.
Okay.
Ms. Bush is trying to get on. If you could just hold for a second.
Mr. Correa?
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded?
Mr. Correa, you are not recorded.
Correa votes aye.
Mr. Correa votes aye.
Hmm? Ms. Bush?
Bush, how is Bush recorded?
Ms. Bush, you are not recorded.
Bush votes yes.